can you hear it okay? I feel like I'm about to fall off.
You want to wait a minute?
Yeah, why don't we?
Okay. I tell you what, we could send somebody from the committee out there. Friends, good morning again, and thank you for staying after worship for this timely opportunity for us to be able to host a community forum. And we are grateful to Trudy Rubin for also allowing us to live stream this special presentation on her experiences in Russia and Ukraine. These community forums were established by a gift from Anna and Herbert Middleton Sr. to the Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church Foundation. We're grateful for their memory, which lives on through their generosity and their long commitment to this church. These forums are intended to serve as an outreach to the larger community by welcoming distinguished speakers to share their expertise on matters pertaining to public welfare and the common good. This church opens its doors to the wider community for many and various events related to mission, interfaith dialogue, matters of social justice, its special musical and artistic offerings. And we are grateful for the opportunity to host this special offering today. Our next community forum will be in the fall on Monday evening, October the 2nd, to hear from Dr. Paul Offit of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and an internationally known leading expert on vaccinations and children as we continue to navigate our way through and out of this pandemic. Before I turn the introduction of our special guest today over to the Forum Committee member Bob Martin, know that after Trudy's presentation, there will be a time for questions and answers. We will have a couple of folks from the committee roaming with microphones so that you can raise your hand and a microphone will be brought your way so that you will be able to ask your question from the floor. We are grateful to Bob Martin for securing this invitation through his friendship with Trudy and for introducing her to us now.
Good morning. Trudy Rubin is the Foreign Affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and is a member of its editorial board. Her Worldview column appears twice weekly in the Inquirer and runs regularly in many other newspapers. In 2019, Trudy received the Overseas Press Club of America's Flora Lewis Award for Best Commentary in International Affairs. In 2001 and 2017, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary. She is the author of Willful Blindness, the Bush Administration, and Iraq. Trudy's expertise in international affairs, and particularly in foreign conflicts, is perhaps best documented by her passport stamps. She is heading back to Ukraine this summer for what will be her 5th trip there. She was in Iraq 12 times from 2003 to 2011. She estimates 8 or 9 trips to Afghanistan during the same period. She was on the ground in Chechnya for the first Russian war there in 1995, and as Middle East correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, she covered the 1982-83 war in Lebanon. She is a graduate of Smith College and the London School of Economics, and she will speak today on Ukraine, NATO, and Putin's war, and what lies ahead. Please welcome Trudy Rubin.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction, and thank you all for staying on. I spoke once here a long time ago, and I'm remembering how elevating it feels. I have never spoken at a pulpit quite like this in my past. So a pleasure to be here to talk about a very painful subject, as you know. In talking about Ukraine, what lies ahead, I want to return a bit to my recent trip there in February, just before the war started, and my last previous trip before that, which was in 2014, right after Russia had invaded the Donbass. Hold on one second. Reaching the water from this height has to be carefully orchestrated. When I was in Ukraine in February, I visited Kiev, Mariupol, and Berdyansk. And I can tell you that it is a very strange feeling to have walked the streets and driven all around Mariupol only 3 months ago, and to have seen a vibrant city where the secretary of the city council told me about how they were trying to improve university education and health care, and how they had just built a new private marina, which I visited, and to have gone out with the Coast Guard from Berdyansk, the first city of 100,000, basically a summer resort town that the Russians occupied. And to have talked with these Coast Guard officers who had escaped from Crimea when the Russians came in 2014. And now I wonder whether they are still alive or are Russian prisoners or are dead. And as for the city of Mariupol, that was a city of mainly Russian speakers, but it is a city that resisted the Russians in 2014 and now was conquered, and that is the only word for it, in Russian operations, which you have seen the results of on television, in which the Ukrainian government said probably killed 20,000 civilians. My translator in Mariupol lived in a 9-story apartment building, of which there were many built in the Soviet times, and they were deliberately targeted over and over again until they crumbled. She survived in a basement with her mother and 3 cats for 5 weeks and told me horror stories, the likes of which I'm sure you have read, and finally made it out in a mad dash in someone's private car, stopped 15 times at Russian checkpoints, that made fun of her and her mother and threatened them along the way. She's now in Europe trying to get to the United States. This young woman has an MBA from Lehigh University and is typical of the educated, smart, talented Ukrainian young people in their 20s and 30s in an economy that was beginning to grow and was headed hopefully for a future that the Russians may well have destroyed if the West loses its nerve. I want to talk a little bit about why Russia invaded, because in order to speak about what lies ahead, one has to try to explore Vladimir Putin's mindset. Of course, you've all read many analyses that say it was because of NATO expansion. In 2008, NATO opened the door to possible Ukrainian membership, but there had basically been no advancement, and there was really no indication that Ukraine was going to be invited to join NATO anytime in the future, in fact, anytime at all. It is clear to me and to analysts that I respect that NATO was not the issue in Putin's invasion. After all, in 2014, when Putin invaded the east of Ukraine in the Donbass, NATO was not even on the table. The reason for the invasion was that the EU had offered better trade conditions to Ukraine, and Ukraine wanted to take this up. It wasn't even about EU membership. And the then president of Ukraine, Mr. Yanukovych, who was in Putin's pocket, refused to allow Ukraine to have better trade relations with the EU. We're talking about trade relations, not NATO membership. And in fact, before the invasion in 2014, the public in Ukraine did not want to join NATO. According to a poll by Pew Research in 2009, just over half of Ukrainians disapproved of NATO, only 28% approved. It was only after Putin's invasion in 2014, first invasion, that Ukrainian pollsters found a plurality of Ukrainians were in favor. And this is an indication that the fervent desire to join NATO now is a consequence of Putin's actions, not the precipitator of them. So why then did Putin invade, and how does that affect the future? You have heard the story change out of Moscow. Initially, when there was an effort a blitz to try to take Kiev, the story was that Putin told his own people that he was fighting Nazism and anti-Semitism. This is an example of the disgusting hypocrisy shown by Putin and the assumption that the rest of the world is blind, deaf, and dumb. The fake stories about Nazism being fed to the public in Moscow are chilling. On the May 9th Victory Day parade, the rhetoric compared the Ukrainians to the Nazis and compared the effort to have victory over Ukraine to the conquest of the Nazis in 1934-5. Let me just tell you a little bit about my experiences in 2014 and in this year, in February, to show you how ridiculous these claims are. In 2014, Putin tried to do just what he is doing now. The aim then was to take the Donbass, roll through the south, link up Russian-controlled land with Crimea, which he wanted to seize and did, and then move west and take Odessa. That southern belt of territory was referred to as Novorossiya in Russia, New Little Russia. And he failed. And the reason he failed is that Russian speakers did not want to be ruled by Putin. I watched the Russian attempt in Odessa in 2014 to spark what they thought would be an uprising of Russian speakers in Odessa. They operate by deliberate provocations. Snipers shot into a march of soccer fans, killing 2 people. Then rumors were spread that the deaths had been caused by pro-Moscow people. There were a small group of pro-Russians who were camped out in a demonstration near a big trade union building. So people spread the rumor in the angry soccer crowd that it was pro-Russians from the camp that had done it. So then the soccer fans raced to the encampment, and a conflict ensued. Meantime, there were self-defense forces in Odessa organized by local business people. I interviewed the head. The head of the self-defense forces was a Jewish computer businessman with a black belt. They did not want violence. Russian speakers, a Russian-speaking town. Local politicians, the self-defense units rushed to the encampment. They tried to break up the clash with the soccer fans and the encampment. 42 people, unfortunately, from the encampment ran into a building that was set in fire by Molotov cocktails. For all we know, it could have come from Russian provocateurs. But the self-defense forces, the local Russian speakers, tried to rescue them. They made a human ladder. Translate up until the present. Vladimir Putin, in his recent speeches and at Victory Day, talked about the heinous murder by Ukrainian Nazis of 42 people in Odessa in 2014. That is how propaganda can be built. And the other argument was given by Putin to his own people was that they were going into Ukraine to save Russian speakers. Well, the fact is that more Russian speakers have died in this war than have been killed by anyone since Hitler. And when it comes to Russian speakers and war, there is little concern when Russian Kremlin leaders are making their plans. After all, in Chechnya, in 1995, I stood on top of a hill above Grozny. And this was before Putin, but this is the Russian modus operandi in war. I watched Russian heavy artillery on a base at the top of this hill fire non-stop into apartment buildings below where Russian ethnic retirees were living because it was warm and cheaper to live in Grozny. In other words, civilian casualties do not matter, and it doesn't matter if they're Russian speakers. If it did, Russia would not have fired point blank into the drama theater in Mariupol, all Russian speakers, women and children, deliberately killing them. It would not have fired into apartment building after apartment building, just like the buildings I saw the Russian army fire into in Grozny, Chechnya. So lies, lies, lies. Why then did Putin go into Ukraine? I think probably most of you have read or heard of Putin's belief that Ukraine is not a legitimate country. I believe, and many analysts believe, that this invasion was undertaken for two reasons. First of all, to divert attention from corruption in Russia. Corruption is eating at Russia. You've all read about the oligarchs. You now see an army which did not succeed initially in Ukraine because of corruption, because the money that was allotted for renovation of the military was spent on palaces and yachts and Swiss bank accounts. And therefore, the Russian troops are still fighting with outdated equipment and were never adequately retrained to fight like a modern army. You've heard of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who was poisoned, barely survived with help of German doctors, went back to Russia and is now imprisoned and will probably stay in prison until Putin leaves, dead or alive. The reason Navalny is of such interest to Putin, excuse me, is because he made his name in investigating and revealing Kremlin corruption. If you have a real interest in Russia, go online and look up Navalny videos, English subtitles, Putin's palace, Medvedev's villas. The team of Navalny made these incredible videos with drones, with people secretly investigating, taking long-range shots of these palaces and yachts. That was a huge embarrassment to Putin and to Medvedev, his trusty ally, the former president in the interim when Putin became prime minister. And these videos got tens of millions of hits from Russian viewers. That's why Navalny is in jail, because he was rousing young people all over the country who were disgusted by corruption. And the second reason, as probably many of you are aware, is the deep desire of Putin to expand the Russian empire, basically to rebuild the Soviet empire, but it's along the same lines. And central to that is retaking control of Ukraine and Belarus. In 2008, Putin was actually quoted as saying to George W. Bush, "You have to understand, George, Ukraine is not even a country." In the last 2 years up to the invasion, Putin repeated over and over again in speeches, including one on the eve of the invasion, that Ukraine had no historical right to exist. He said, separate from the Russians. He said, modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet empire, that set up a fake country, and that he said true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. And over again, he has described in lengthy screeds how Ukraine is really part of historic Russia and has only come into being as a country because Lenin and the communists did it and because the West and NATO are doing it. It belongs to Russia. Ukraine is not a legitimate state. So why then did he invade now? And then I'm going to get to what I think must and must not be done in the future. For one thing, I believe that Putin thought that mistakenly that Zelensky was a clown. He hated Zelensky. If you haven't already seen it, I highly recommend going to Netflix and finding a series called Servant of the People. This is the show that Zelensky made when he was a comedian. It's in Russian. It showed widely inside Russia, and all over Ukraine. It's what made Zelensky a famous figure. And life and art are totally intermixed here, because the series is about a history teacher who believes in democracy and complains to his students. This is in the period after Ukrainian independence, but when Moscow still has a heavy hand on Ukraine, complains to his students about Russian-led corruption by oligarchs in Ukraine. One of his students videos this explosion, this speech he gives to the kids, and puts it out on the internet, and it goes viral. There's a presidential election, someone puts his name up unknown to him, and he's elected president. And it's about an idealist trying to navigate in a world controlled by Russian-backed Ukrainian oligarchs. You can see why Putin hated it. It's full of Putin jokes, even jokes about Putin's alleged relationship with his mistress, the former Olympics gymnast, whose name I have conveniently forgotten. But people who understand Russian tell me that there's even more anti-Putin jokes that are translated into English. So, thinking Zelensky was a clown, Putin thought that he could just send in hit teams of Chechens and of mercenaries known as Wagner. It's his personal mercenary team, sort of like some of the secret service, not secret service, some of the groups that have operated former military in Iraq, like Blackwater, only this Wagner is much more evil, no holds bar officially, and Blackwater was evil, but this is many more times evil. So he sent in teams of mercenaries. They were supposed to fly into an airport near Kiev and go in and either seize and take to Moscow for trial or kill Zelensky. And somehow Putin imagined that it would be easy to install a pro-Putin Ukrainian to take over the government. The fact that he thought this was possible showed, one, how little he knew about Ukraine, and two, that he was totally misled by his intelligence people. But he thought he could get away with it. He thought that Russian speakers would go along with it. He wanted it done by May 9th so he could celebrate it on Victory Day, and he thought it would be easy. We see how wrong he was on all of these fronts. So where does that bring us? To the question of the hour, which is, has Western aid to Ukraine been the correct approach for us to take? Has it been sufficient? Has it been wise? And where should it go for the future? I am of the school that believes that this aid was absolutely necessary. Think what Putin did. He invaded a country on his border, a country, by the way, which was a founding member of the United Nations. When the Soviet Union joined the United Nations, there were some parts of the Soviet Union that were billed as separate states within the Union, and Ukraine was one. So they were a founding member of the UN, an independent country with an elected government. And Putin simply invaded, bombed, and tried to take it over. A country which is on the border of a NATO member, NATO members, Poland, Romania. Had the West done nothing, had they given carte blanche for Putin to annex and control Ukraine, which would have been a green light for Putin to take over all non-NATO members in the area around Russia that were once part of the Soviet Union, then NATO might as well have folded up shop. because Putin would then have been convinced that NATO was too timid to confront a change to the bottom line rules that kept peace in Europe after World War II, that you don't invade and take over other countries by force. And if NATO could not even assist a country that was being forcibly seized, invaded, occupied, and in Russian hopes annexed, then the next test would have been for NATO countries like the Baltics, small countries which were on the border of Russian territory and which Putin had his eye on. He would have assumed that NATO, despite Article 5, would not have come to their aid because it didn't want a war with Russia. So I think it was absolutely essential to come to Ukraine's aid. The tragedy to me is that we didn't do it fast enough. On the one hand, I commend President Biden because I think he has done more than anyone would have expected. If Donald Trump had been president, there's no question what would have happened. He simply would have let Putin do what he wished with Ukraine because Trump had a grievance against Ukraine, as we saw around the time of the 2016 election, and then in 2018, he wanted Zelensky to dig up dirt on Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, and he was threatening to cut off any military aid, and our military aid was quite limited then, unless Zelensky did his bidding. So Trump had made clear he had no use for Ukraine, he didn't care about it, and frankly, he was disinterested in NATO. I think there would have been no aid. Instead, Biden has gotten the NATO allies together, that is good, and he has gradually given more and more heavy weapons. But what worries me is that these weapons are coming in too slowly, and we are now at a critical point in the Ukraine war. The first part, Ukraine had advantage because the Russians were in small groups or in villages, and the nimble Ukrainians who fought brilliantly, who have a Western-trained system in their military which allows low-level officers, as in U.S. forces, to take initiative. This worked brilliantly when the war was in the north. But now we're seeing a World War II type battle where it's in the east, which abuts Russia, so it's much easier for them to bring in logistics, and heavy artillery, missiles, airplanes are critical, and Ukraine is getting them too slowly. Also, anti-ship missiles. It is a mystery to me why NATO countries, including the U.S., did not immediately send sophisticated anti-ship missiles to Ukraine, which would have helped in Mariupol with Russian warships offshore, which would still help in Odessa to keep those warships from coming within missile range. I believe that the weapons that are coming now, it's always one step behind. We should have encouraged Polish planes being delivered. We should have sent long-range anti-missile systems, trained them on Patriots. And the heavy artillery and rocket launchers that we're sending now should have been sent 2 months ago. But the situation is what it is. So we are looking now at something of a stalemate, and suddenly you begin to see NATO members, pundits, old hands like Henry Kissinger, the New York Times editorial page getting cold feet, saying we have to push Ukraine into negotiations, they have to give up territory, they should be neutral, they should settle for EU membership and give up hopes of joining NATO. The problem with these analyses is that Ukraine has already offered to do all of the above. Putin is not interested. Kissinger, for example, said Ukraine should go back to the status quo ante before this current invasion. Zelensky offered that weeks ago. He said, go back to status quo ante ceasefire and negotiate over Crimea and the parts of the Donbass that Russia held before 2022 invasion, and that parts were only about 1/3 of the Donbass. Putin is not interested. People talk about neutrality. It's very interesting because the synonym for neutrality used to be Finlandization. Why? Because Finland fought a war with the Soviet Union, I think just before World War II, and fought bravely and ferociously, but again was outmatched in numbers. And so it made a Finlandization deal where Russians essentially controlled Finland's politics. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Finns were thrilled to get rid of Finlandization. They now consider it a dirty word, and you notice they've just applied to join NATO, along with Sweden. So if Finland, of Finlandization fame, feels it must be in NATO, then clearly neutrality is a risky business. Not join NATO. Zelensky has already made clear he doesn't expect to be invited to join NATO. A solution is for them to join the EU, not NATO. Oh, that would be lovely. Zelensky wants it. But Macron and Scholz of Germany are now backing off on that because they say there's other applicants ahead of Ukraine. It would be years. They're trying to placate Putin. Putin does not want Ukraine to join the EU. Then the most absurd one I've seen is an article by somebody from RAND called Samuel Charup that's in Foreign Affairs now. And he's saying there should be an internationally legal security pact, including Russia, with the United States and Europeans to assure Ukraine that Russia would never invade again. Excuse me? In 1994, there was such a pact. It involved Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, which it had after the fall of the Soviet Union. And Russia agreed, along with the United States and the United Kingdom, to assure Ukraine's sovereignty. We can see how well Russia respected that pact. After the 2014 invasion, there was something called the Minsk Accords and negotiations over the control by Russia of parts of the Donbass. Russia reneged on that, never lived up to it, and made new demands. So the idea that Putin is going to negotiate in good faith with Ukraine, unless he is forced to, is just wishful thinking at best. Strategic foolishness is more like the words. Putin's goal is to bleed Ukraine, to control the south, cut them off from the seacoast, control the east, which was once their industrial area, and leave a bleeding rump. He does not need a peace agreement. He just needs to turn Ukraine into a basket case, hoping the population will get rid of Zelensky because he failed, hoping that Europe will get sick of sanctions, that Americans will get sick of funding weapon systems, and that Ukraine, in desperation, will turn to Mother Moscow. That is where things stand now. So let me just say a few sentences about what lies ahead, and then I'll stop for questions. In my mind, the only way to bring Putin to the table is to convince him he has more to lose than to gain by continuing this war and arming Ukraine sufficiently so it can mount a counteroffensive pushing Putin's troops out of the south. I think Mariupol may be a lost cause, but at least out of the areas that prevent Ukraine from accessing shipping lanes. Along these lines, NATO and the international community and the UN have to make clear in some form that the Black Sea is an international waterway and that commercial shipping, including grain exports, must be permitted according to international law. The Russians are playing games with this. I can talk about it more in questions if you're interested. You may say, well, we can't give more weapons because it would alienate Russia and they might use nukes. I have written repeatedly, and I firmly believe, and I think Europe and the US are coming around to this, Putin is bluffing. He can't afford to nuke the US or Europe because his Moscow would be destroyed with him in it, and a tactical nuclear attack on a Ukrainian city gets him nothing. He has killed more people in Mariupol and destroyed the entire city than he would with a tactical weapon. That would only turn those parts of the world against him that are now on the fence, like China and India. So I think the West has a choice right now to act now, to escort ships to Odessa, to send planes, to send Patriot missiles and Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and make clear, as Biden has done, that regime change is not the objective, but the objective is to help Ukraine push back an unwarranted invasion of a peaceful nation that cannot stand if Europe is to be a free continent. I don't know whether we will move fast enough. And the more territory that Moscow takes, the harder it will be to dislodge them. But for Ukraine to lose now will only encourage Putin's recklessness. And I think that would be a huge tragedy, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe and the United States. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to take questions. And I just ask you, if you have a question, please make it brief, because I want to get in as many questions as I can. I'm willing to go over time, but if they are long, that takes away the opportunity of somebody else. And maybe if you stand when you ask it so other people can hear you. But I'll repeat the question if there's any need.
Can you talk a little bit about who the Russian separatists actually are? Because I have not heard much about that. I mean, are they Putin pawns? Are they people who really want to secede from Ukraine?
It's a good question. Can I talk about who the separatists really are? I was in the city of Donetsk, which is the main city of Donetsk Oblast, which is like a province. And in Donbass, there are two such provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, and each of them has a major city. So I was there in 2014 after the separatists had arrived. And I can tell you, having interviewed all of the separatist leadership, these were people sent from Moscow. They were Ukrainians often, but they were people who worked with Russian special forces. You have to understand that when the Soviet Union broke up, there were a lot of Russian intelligence people that were left in countries where Moscow had a huge interest. That included Ukraine. And many Ukrainians served in the Russian Secret Service, and sometimes they went into the Ukrainian intelligence service, but sometimes they just kept on serving Moscow. These people, some of them were thugs. One of them had been convicted of running a Ponzi scheme in Moscow. Some of them were people who had fought in the Russian military. That is not to say that nobody in the Donbass wanted to remain part of the Soviet Union, but you mainly found that in two categories of people. There were a lot of retired Russian military who had settled in that area, and their children had been brought up loyal to Moscow. So you had some people in that category, but I can tell you that I knew a group of them who were in the basement with my translator, and she told me they had all changed their minds and they hate Putin now with the depth of anyone who is a Ukrainian with no use for the Kremlin. The other category was old people. I interviewed a lot of babushkas, people who remember World War II when the Soviet army rescued Ukraine from the Nazis. And what happened is, as soon as the thugs came in with the guns and took over the administration of Donetsk, they cut off access to Ukrainian television. Ukrainians only saw Russian television. And I can tell you that Russian television makes anything you've imagined on Fox News or on the weirdest corners of the alt-right internet look like kindergarten. And so they believed that the Ukrainians were coming to rape their daughters and kill them. And so in the past years, since 2014, 8 years, kids have been schooled in Russian propaganda. And as I said, Russia has basically let the economy rot. So the only thing for teenagers to do and make money is join the separatist forces. In Crimea, the situation was a little bit different because you did have a lot of Russians who lived there, who had retired there, and there was a Russian military base, a lot of families. So you had more pro-Russians in Crimea. But I would say, from talking to people there, it was 50-50 before the Russians took over, and the other half mostly left, because the Russians have treated pro-Ukrainians who stayed on under occupation the way they say Ukraine treated Russian speakers, which wasn't so. And I just very quickly mention something else. You may have heard of the Azov Battalion. They're the ones who held out in Mariupol until the very end. Putin uses this as the whipping boy, saying that Ukrainian soldiers are Nazis. The Azov Battalion originated in Western Ukraine, and there were some youth groups there that considered as heroes Ukrainians who fought with the Nazis in World War II to get rid of the Soviets. One doesn't have to endorse their fighting with the Nazis, but they are dead. And the Azov Battalion has been co-opted into the regular Ukrainian army. They are forbidden to use any pro-Nazi symbols. And the irony of Putin harping on that is that there are more openly pro-Nazi groups in Russia than you ever would have seen in Ukraine in the worst of times. And Wagner, as I said, the mercenary force whose head is close to Putin, reportedly the reason the name is Wagner is that one of the creators of this force considered the conductor and the musical composer Wagner as a hero and liked his Nazi symbols. So it is total hypocrisy, and the separatists, a large part, especially in Donetsk, are manufactured.
If Putin is going to be stopped, who might be able to do that, or how might that come about?
The only way that stopped implies that he's going to be overthrown. I don't see that happening, and if it happens, it's going to be in some internal way that we can't envision. He is surrounded by sycophants. None of them is likely to pull out a gun and shoot him. It's just not on order. And so I do not see the way that he will be overthrown. On the other hand, there is an election in 2024, and even though he totally rigs them, you're never going to tell what will happen. But I think what has to happen is that Putin has to see that he cannot achieve his goal of making Ukraine into an international basket case where the public will give up on Zelensky and look to Moscow, that he cannot succeed at that. And in order to fail, the West cannot lose its nerve. It has to keep on the sanctions, which are not really going to hit home for some time yet. It has to send more weapons of the kind that Ukraine has been begging for, planes, long-range anti-missile systems, multiple rocket launchers, long-range artillery, and as soon as possible, because the critical battles are being fought now. And it has to organize convoys to allow the grain to be taken out. The West has to show that it will support Ukraine on the battlefield until Russian gains in the south are reversed. It regains control of access to the Black Sea. The Russian blockade of the Black Sea is declared illegal and opposed by international guarantees. And then, maybe some kind of negotiation can be carried on. But in the meantime, there have to be other guarantees to Ukraine that they will not be left alone, that they will continue to be armed, and that the EU will put them on top of the list. That is a big shopping list. But if NATO and the US don't handle it that way, then we are going to go into a stalemate in which Ukraine has less resources and the bleeding costs more because their population is lower, and Russia doesn't care how many people die. The Kremlin is totally indifferent to loss of soldiers. So the time is now, and I think it's dangerous that you see around the fringes of the GOP this stop sending money to Ukraine. If we fail at this, now that we have stood up big for Ukraine, it will be even worse than if we had let Russia take the country in the beginning. Maybe not worse, because in either way, it will prove that the West doesn't have the stomach to keep Russia from taking other countries by force, and China will get the message too.
Do you have suggestions on a responsible strategy that the world can take with many of the wealthy Russian expatriates that are living in the world and attending schools and putting their money into our institutions that we can take? Maybe this is related to sanctions.
I think, as you've probably seen, that has started. I mean, it is tricky. There are some medium wealthy Russians who send their kids to school here or to university, and really they have no control whatsoever over what Putin does. And, they may have even earned their money legitimately. But as far as oligarchs who can be tracked to Putin, We have sanctioned, I may get the numbers wrong, but I think there's about 130 potential oligarchs with ties to the Kremlin. We've sanctioned less than a third of them. So obviously that can continue. And there is also the beginnings of a push for legislation in Congress to sanction American lawyers, public relations firms, yacht managers, people who help the people who are connected to Putin corruption or armaments. And I think that would be good legislation, and the Brits should follow it too. And widen the net. If you haven't read Bill Browder's book, the new book, Freezing Order, it's worth doing to understand better how the corruption nets work and the Americans who enable it. And those enablers should be sanctioned as well.
I read in the newspaper this morning that there were 60 to 100 Ukrainian soldiers being lost on a daily basis. I just wondered how strong the military remains and can they hold out?
No, it's a very good question because obviously the Russian strategy is destroy, destroy, destroy. And Zelensky himself has said that 100 military are dying a day, and in order to keep supplying troops, the volunteer forces, the territorial defense forces, which were civilian volunteers, are being sent directly into combat, which wasn't the original intention. And I watched territorial defense forces train outside of Kiev, and many of them are like many of you. I mean, they're engineers, accountants, professors, and so forth, anywhere from their 30s to their 50s, and sometimes even their 60s, and they're being sent into battle where they may never have shot a gun before. They got some training in going into the territorial defense units, but they didn't get the kind of heavy training you need to be out on the front. This is why it is so urgent to get heavier weapons to the front, because what's being fought now is more of a traditional war, and what the Russians are doing, they have drones too. Now they try to locate where Ukrainian forces are, and then they shoot rockets or artillery from way off and try to wipe out those forces. It's a war being fought by distance, and the Ukrainians don't have the long-range artillery to strike back. And now some of those missiles are coming from inside Russia. And you know that Biden just said that we're sending them longer-range rocket launches, but we've got a commitment that they can't fire into Russia. It's really tragic when you think that Russia launched this war. Russia is raping and destroying a country to the extent that Hitler did to cities in Europe, and we did in revenge, and they can't strike back on Russian soil. But even be that as it may, if they could reach those long-range rockets, they wouldn't be losing forces at the rate that they are now. It's heartbreaking. And it's not just the US, but it's the Europeans who are slow off the mark. Biden is better, but it is at emergency pitch now, because these are World War II type battles, except they're not being fought hand-to-hand. They're being fought with long-range artillery that the Ukrainians don't have yet.
Yes, why do you feel that the U.S. has to be the impetus behind supporting Ukraine when the neighborhood, the European Union and Germany, France, all those countries seem to be taking a back seat?
Well, first of all, Britain is taking a front seat. Boris Johnson, who has a lot of sins to account for, has been very upfront on this, and maybe to get attention away from Partygate, but still, he has gone to Kiev. So the British are sending stuff. The Germans, as you know, have humongously increased their defense budget and keep promising more heavy weaponry. They have a political problem, which is the Social Democrats have the prime ministership. The Social Democrats have always been, peace in our time with Russia. Scholz is promising some long-range artillery. But again, his partner, the Greens, is all for it, but there are people in his party that are politically against it. And so this is a real struggle. I mean, Holland is pitching in. France is, to say annoying, is to understate it. Emmanuel Macron wants to get the Nobel Prize for peacemaking, and Putin is making a fool of him. And so Macron, at the beginning of the war, went to Moscow and then told the world that he had convinced Putin to have a ceasefire. Of course, he hadn't, and he looked like an idiot. But he keeps calling Putin, and nothing happens. So the Brits are on, the Germans are on, the Balts, even though they're small, are sending a lot of equipment. Poland, as you know, is hosting 3.5 million refugees and also sending equipment. Eastern Europe understands what the game is. So it's politics. I mean, we're doing this because it's vital for us and NATO, and Biden is trying to herd sheep, or if not sheep, there's some, I don't know, I don't want to call them wolves, but I mean, there's some Europeans who get what's going on and are really contributing. And then you also have to note that the sanctions are things that we thought, Europe would never even begin to sign on to, even though there's loopholes in the new oil sanctions and gas is a problem. But for example, the Baltics have now stopped buying Russian gas. I mean, Europe is trying to pull together on this, and Biden is essential, and the Americans, in keeping them on focus. And I think that it's extraordinarily important that Sweden and Finland have decided to join in NATO, because both those countries have very strong militaries, even though they're small countries. And I think that will also give impetus. The problem is that, unfortunately, time is of the essence, because we're getting to the point that if Putin, Russian forces, can cement their hold on the south of Ukraine and take Odessa or keep blocking Odessa, Ukraine cannot survive economically. The Russians have to be pushed back. So the more territory they take now, the more that Ukraine will have to retake, which takes even more weaponry and more manpower. So the urgency is now, and I think Biden understands that more than some of his team. I'm going to take one more, if there is one more, otherwise I'll let you all go.
The item I was about to ask is a question. Do you believe that NATO's naval forces, perhaps led by the United States, should force the opening of Russia's blockade of Odessa to permit Ukraine economically to export its grains to the desperate needs of the West?
I think that there needs to be some kind of international escort. I think it would be better if it were broader than NATO, but I think it's essential that there, now Britain, Johnson had talked about a British military escort. There's been talks about reflagging civilian ships that are coming to take grain out, as we did with ships in the Persian Gulf in the 1980s when Iran was attacking oil tankers. Some formula is needed right now. And what Putin is suggesting is that the grain can be exported through Mariupol. In other words, Ukraine can give its grain to the Russians and they'll, through their captured city. That's not going to fly. So I'm not sure what the formula is. General Jim Stavridis is coming up with a formula as the former head of NATO, Sakura. I'm going to write another column about this week. I gave some suggestions in a column I wrote just before I went to Ireland, so I think it ran around May 17th. And I'm going to try this week to look at, I don't think NATO as NATO is the best idea, but I think there has to be a coalition of the willing, including Turkey. Turkey and Bulgaria have territory on the Black Sea, so does Romania. Actually, no. Is Turkey on the Black? Turkey controls the access, and they can bar warships, or they can allow them in. So we need a formula, and we need it now. And it's not going to be a Putin formula. And NATO has to be a party in designing it.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you. We love your passion. Thank you for taking the time to answer the questions as well. And thank you all for coming out this morning and being here.